Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
It's been more than 100 days since we've been able to gather in this chamber, and certainly a lot of history has been made during that time. It's had a profound impact on British Columbians. There have been impacts on families, there have been impacts on communities, and of course, there have been those who have been stricken by the disease and those who have unfortunately died due to the disease. But now, our task, and what brings us here, is to move British Columbia into the future, to talk about making British Columbia a better place, to talk about recovery. Now, we're concerned as the opposition because we heard last week that rather than disclosing a plan for economic recovery in British Columbia, the Premier's decided to embark on another survey that will last for weeks. And so we have to turn to the Premier and say, we can do better. You can do better as the government. We must do better, so that British Columbians have some sense of hope that they can recover from this without massive job loss and business insolvency. So the question goes to the Premier. Will the Premier take a simple, straightforward step like suspending sales tax, hotel tax, and employers' health tax for 90 days?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I want to also welcome those who are sitting in their offices across British Columbia and those that are joining us here in the legislature today for what will be, I think, an extraordinary question period for all of us. And I do appreciate the member's question, and I do know he would agree with me that the past 100 days have been extraordinary for British Columbians, whether they be employees or employers. And we've been taking steps collectively, Mr. Speaker, to address issues as they've emerged, whether it be in the hospitality sector, whether it be in construction, whether it be in a range of sectors. We've been working hand in hand with leaders, with workers, to come forward with proposals and suggestions. I'd also say that members of this House, on all sides, in all parties, have been providing advice and counsel to government. And we've been taking that greatly and putting it into action in many sectors. What we're doing now is asking British Columbians what their thoughts are. We have the opportunities and the luxury and the privilege of sitting in this place, of penning letters, of making comments, and engaging with people in a way that British Columbians don't. So this is not a delay in Restart. We have been going since the middle of May. We have been adding to the basket of initiatives, a $5 billion commitment that the Minister of Finance and I made in our action plan not that long ago. And I know the member on the other side will be supporting us as we go forward, but action does not mean precluding British Columbians.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've had the fortunate opportunity to speak to British Columbians all over this province in the last 100 days in electronic town halls of up to 11,000 people, listening to their concerns, listening to their worries. British Columbians are extremely concerned about the future, starting now, but certainly going into the fall, where bills will become due, including all the deferred taxes and fees from this government, and they're looking for ideas about how we can recover. It's not just about opening the doors again. That's a public health declaration. It's not an economic plan, because British Columbians are feeling impoverished, they're feeling worried about the ability to go out and spend and participate in the economy, and so we see on the streets of Victoria, they're virtually empty during the business day because people do not have confidence that they can get out there and participate in the economy again. So we're asking this Premier to think about the people who have mortgages, the people who have kids, the people who want to go to work, whether as an employee or as an employer, or both for that matter. So we ask the Premier a simple query that we've had on the table for 3 months now. Will the Premier suspend sales tax, hotel tax, and employers' health tax for 90 days to jumpstart the BC economy?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And we have been working since March to put in place initiatives to protect workers, to protect businesses. $5 billion, $1.5 billion of that remains for a stimulus package that will be rolling out in the days ahead to make sure that British Columbians stand in good stead across the country and indeed around the world. I think it's important for the Leader of the Opposition and members in this House and at home to remember that this is not a British Columbia problem. This is an international problem, and it requires extraordinary efforts on all of our parts to make sure we're doing everything we can to ensure British Columbians come out ahead at the end of this. And certainly we have bent the curve as British Columbians by listening to the counsel and guidance of Dr. Henry and Minister Dix as we laid out the health challenges that people were facing. And I would suggest to the member, and I'm sure he knows this, that in order to build confidence for consumers to go back into retail, into hospitality, and other sectors that require that type of activity, we're going to have to do a couple of things. We're going to have to make sure that the workplace is safe. WorkSafe BC has been working with the public health officers to make sure that we put in place guidelines so that customers can be comfortable when they go into an establishment that they're going to be safe and the workers in there are safe as well. This cannot be done by snapping fingers. It cannot be done by edicts brought forward in question period, but I'm happy, as I have been for the past number of weeks, to read suggestions and hear suggestions from members of this House anytime, anywhere. The member put forward some tax changes. I suggest he take those issues up with the Minister of Finance, who's always happy to talk about how we can make sure our economy continues to grow. And it's going to be a challenging 100 days ahead of us, Honourable Member, and you know that full well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We hear the Premier talking consistently about public health measures, which actually don't have anything to do with economic recovery. The federal government has spent $7,000 for every living, breathing human being in this country in an economic support and stimulus package. So far, the provincial government has spent 1/10 of that, $700. It's a paltry contribution to a colossal problem. We have more than 500,000 British Columbians who are not employed now compared to a year ago. This crisis has disproportionately damaged the careers of women and youth. And I think we all know young people who are now adrift, living on a federal check for $1,250 a month, wondering where their future lies. It cries out for leadership from this government to talk about what the future holds for British Columbians. So once more, I'll ask the Premier, is he prepared to look at a serious, simple, immediate remedy for this problem by creating that confidence that comes from reducing taxes? Drop the sales tax, drop the employer's health tax, drop the hotel tax for 90 days, and give British Columbians a chance to get ahead, Premier.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I guess perhaps we're not getting press releases through to the official opposition. That surprises me. They're readily available on the internet, gov.bc.ca. The emergency benefit for workers, $1,000, is already $250 higher than the number that the member articulated there. This month, another $451 through the Climate Action Tax Credit will be going to families who deserve that, up to families of 4. We'll see $450. A temporary rent supplement, the only province in the country to bring forward a temporary rent supplement because of the high cost of housing in British Columbia. The members might be aware of how that happened over time, but we're the only province to put that in place, and we're going to advance it for a couple of more months as we go forward. There will be a $1,000 grant for those seeking a diploma, a certificate, or a degree come September, the first time a non-refundable grant will be available to young people in British Columbia in 16 years. So we're doing our part, Honourable Speaker. We're doing our part to lay the groundwork for a very challenging future. And I'm under no illusion, and I know the members under no illusion as well. We need to continue to work together. I appreciate that the responsibility of the opposition is to hold us accountable. I'm fine with that, but don't make stuff up. We've already far exceeded the last comments in your question. I'm sure we'll hear more as the half an hour progresses.
Member for Richmond, Queensborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses are pleading with the Minister of Labour to change employment rules to extend layoff time limits to the end of August, plus an additional 6 weeks once emergency orders are lifted, Mr. Speaker. This is what Anita Huberman from the Surrey Board of Trade had to say. Quote, revisit your recent negative response to the business community. Take action. Severance payments will be significant and in many cases will lead to bankruptcy. Is that what the BC government wants? End quote. To the Minister of Labour, will he listen to the Surrey Board of Trade and fully extend the time limit as small businesses are requesting?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. We did hear of this issue. We put in place the variance or the extension in the first place. There is, under Section 72 of the Employment Standards Act, an opportunity for businesses to seek variance. I understand from correspondence from them today that's not adequate for their needs. We're quite happy to continue to engage in discussion. This is an important issue. The member knows that, but I hope the businesses are not saying through you to the House and to workers across British Columbia that the severance that they earned, those workers earned over many, perhaps potentially decades of employment with the companies in question, are to give up that severance. Because if that's the proposition that you're putting forward, we disagree with it. The question at hand here is, can we find a way for businesses and workers to find an accommodation so that we can get back to where we were pre-COVID? That's our objective. But if you're suggesting that the severance that's owed to those employees should be forgiven, that's not on.
Member for Richmond, Queensborough on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is what I'm suggesting. In my community, Richmond, Queensborough, the constituency that I represent, I have a small events company. They have 6 employees. 5 of them have been laid off. They are getting to the point, well, they'll have to pay severance. That cost, that company can't afford. They will have to declare bankruptcy. There will be no job for those employees to go back to. And I remind the Premier, just think about that for a second, that this small business that employs 6 people has survived the COVID pandemic, but isn't going to survive NDP policy. That's the issue here, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that various organizations around British Columbia had to send a letter today, up until yesterday, in fact, up until 2 hours ago, the answer was no from the Minister of Labour. Absolutely no. Instead, you have the Vancouver Board of Trade, the Surrey Board of Trade, the BC Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, ICBA, the Restaurant Canada, Retail Council, BC Hotel Association have collectively spoken in one voice that this is a clear and present issue. Just the other day, BCBCs also stated that with 200,000 small businesses in this problem, they expect 10 to 15% to go under by the end of 2021. That's what we're talking about here. It's the small mom and pop shops that are impacted, the backbone of our economy, Mr. Speaker. The business community is also saying today, quote, BC employers will be faced with regulated chaos as the clock ticks down to deadlines beginning in early July, forcing many businesses by law to terminate laid-off employees and pay out severance, end quote. Will the Labour Minister act now before it's too late?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, we're happy to engage with the business community on these issues. They're important issues. The issue of severance, however, is at the core of this question. And I hope it's the official opposition's position that those workers deserve that severance regardless of what goes forward. We're happy to work with small businesses through their representatives, either through the BC Chamber or through the Boards of Trade. I have a meeting on Thursday with them. We'll engage in that discussion at that time, and I'm confident we'll find a way forward that meets the interests of those businesses as well as those employees.
House Leader, third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'd like to begin, Honourable Speaker, just by commending the Minister of Health and the Provincial Health Officer for their steady guidance through the last 100 days, and I know that the people of BC are very grateful for their open and transparent communication on such an ongoing basis. Honourable Speaker, during this pandemic, we've seen outbreaks occur in many of our province's long-term care homes and assisted living facilities. 585 cases as of June 17th can be linked to those outbreaks, and heartbreakingly, 116 residents or patients have died of COVID-19. An important aspect of this tragedy is the part-time hours many frontline workers are hired for. This resulted in many employees, mostly women and visible minorities, working in multiple facilities to make ends meet, causing them unwittingly to spread the virus between multiple homes. I welcome the fact that the government has ordered employees to only work at one facility and provided a backstop for those who have suffered financial hardship as a result. The Premier has said that he, quote, thinks that you can anticipate that will be, in fact, you can be certain that will be the norm going forward, end quote. My question for you, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Health. How will government ensure that employees are being paid a living wage so that they can afford to work at only one facility? And when can we expect to see legislation that will make these changes truly permanent? Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. Thank you to the member for her question. The single site order that was put in place pursuant to the medical health officer or the provincial health officer's orders included a very significant change that made it happen. This involved, by the way, 501 facilities and 48,795 employees working in those facilities, 8,800 of whom worked at multiple sites. So what's happened? All 501 right now, all 501 have single site orders in place. All 8,874 employees have been assigned to a single site. In addition, all of them, not just the 8,874 affected by the single site order, are seeing a top up to their wages to bring them up to HEABC negotiated levels. And those who have a particular pay grade go to the highest pay grade if they're at multiple sites. So these are significant changes. I want to say that we made this happen by making those investments, by supporting the process. Other provinces have talked about this. The British Columbia, with the support of all political parties, have acted. And I want to thank everyone involved in healthcare who've made it happen. Those orders are going to be in place for some time and give us the opportunity to work on the future. But I have to say that it has been the contribution of unions such as the HEU, of employers such as those represented by Denominational Health and the BC Care Providers Association, who've helped make it happen. This has been a Team BC approach, and it has to continue to be a Team BC approach to ensure that workers are protected, but most importantly, those people living in long-term care are given the care that they need and that they deserve.
House Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that response. Currently, BC spends $1.3 billion per year contracting for-profit companies and not-for-profit societies to operate 2/3 of the province's long-term care beds. The not-for-profit sector spends almost $10,000 or 24% more per resident per year than the for-profit sectors on direct care. One of the biggest reasons for this disparity is the for-profit sector underpays their care aid staff by as much as 28% compared to the industry standard. Not only that, according to the latest report from the BC Seniors Advocate, the for-profit sector failed to deliver 207,000 hours of funded care, which means over 200,000 hours of care paid for with public funds was never provided. In contrast, the not-for-profit sector provided every hour they were funded to deliver, and then 80,000 hours more. My question through you, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Health. On March 4th, 2020, the Minister said in relation to for-profit companies, and I quote, "They have the responsibility to provide care. We have the responsibility to regulate, and we will," end quote. When and how will for-profit companies be held to these responsibilities?
Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the supplementary question. I think you'll note that the report of the Seniors Advocate was based on the fiscal year 2017-18. Since then, a number of changes have occurred that are important. Unanimously in this House, members supported Bill 47, which got rid of Bills 29 and 94 and empowered healthcare workers in a way that hadn't happened before, gave them the same rights as other workers in society. In addition, since that time, we've significantly increased funded care hours, particularly for those two sectors, particularly for the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors who provide public beds in BC, such that at the end of this year, we're going to move from 3.1 care hours per resident day to 3.37 care hours per resident day. And even more important than that, 75 care homes, all private or not-for-profit, were funded at under 2.9 at that time, care hours per resident day. Just to put that in context, that is more than 3 hours per week per resident of direct care under provincial standard. There were 75 such care homes. Now there are 0. And we've also brought in place, again, working with a Team BC approach, with new mechanisms both to enforce contracts and a new web-based tool, which will be moving to this summer to assist everybody in ensuring that the hours provided and the funding provided by government are in fact delivered by providers. We're doing this by working together. This is a Made in BC approach. It involves not-for-profit, it involves for-profit, it involves associations of employers and unions. And we are moving forward to improve seniors care in this province. And those changes Bill 47, the hiring of new care aides, the increase in care standards have made a significant difference in BC as we've gone through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Member Kamloops North Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the answers the Premier gave to the member from Richmond Queensborough seem to be a little bit all over the map. On the one hand, he's saying that the Premier is saying this is an issue that's just come up, makes it sound like it just came up, makes it sound like it's something that they're fundamentally opposed to, yet this government had already extended it from 13 weeks to 16 weeks for a temporary layoff. And then makes it sound as if they've always been open and willing to discuss, even though last week his minister made it very clear there would be no extension. Mr. Speaker, there are 133,000 British Columbians who are on temporary layoff right now. Thousands of small businesses, they need that certainty now, or there will not be 133,000 jobs for them to come back to. Organizations representing thousands of small businesses have written today, and I quote, "Through your inaction now, Minister, you are dismissing the gravity of the situation still facing many businesses who have been forced to close or curtail operations and lay off workers." End quote. So to the Minister of Labour or the Premier, will the time limits be extended today?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And as I said to the member for Richmond Queensborough, we felt that the provisions under Section 72 of the Employment Standards Act were adequate for companies that were affected to take that avenue. Clearly, the opposition and those that have written the letter today have a different view on that matter, and I'm absolutely prepared to go back and take another look at it. This isn't about trying to stop people from succeeding. Quite the contrary. We've been spending the past 100 days doing the exact opposite, trying to make sure we're putting in place initiatives that will help people, whether it be working with the very businesses that you just articulated in convincing the federal government to fully fund a sick pay operation that will allow people to not go back to work when they're sick because of an economic imperative. That was driven by the very people that the member just articulated to me. So it's not like we haven't been working closely with the BC Business Council, with the boards of trade, with the BC Chamber of Commerce. Quite the contrary, we've been working very closely with them to try and find ways that we can collaborate, workers, employers, community groups, to find a better way forward. And I hope the opposition will join us. I'm happy to revisit this issue with these groups as early as Thursday.
Member Kamloops North Thompson on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, these groups have been voicing these concerns for quite some time now, and they're not waiting for the Premier to find yet another federal program to try to ride the coattails on and make it look like it's a provincial program. The minister's response last week to this issue was to say that employers can request a variance. We heard the Premier reference the variances as well earlier. The business community responded to that today, and here's another quote. "This is a hollow offering and frankly, Minister, insulting to the many businesses struggling to recover or simply keep their doors open." End quote. So perhaps the Premier can enlighten all of us and tell us what the average time it will be for a business to get a variance application approved by the Employment Standards Branch.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We've been absolutely overwhelmed by the extraordinary work of government employees over the past 100 days, doing things going beyond anything they had imagined when they took on their oath of office and they signed on to work for the people of British Columbia. Whether it be to go to airports to add more resources to protect our borders with federal employees, whether it be to work on issues like this. We have regular meetings with the Economic Recovery Task Force where every corner of government is coming together, a cross-government approach. I just said to the member's first question, Honourable Speaker, I'm happy to revisit this question, and we'll do so as early as Thursday when I have all of these people on a telephone call. If that's not an adequate answer, you can ask me another question.
Member for Prince George Vilmont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And frankly, to the Premier, that isn't an adequate answer. Today, the Minister of Labour received an absolutely scathing letter from organizations representing thousands of workers across the province. We've heard several quotes, but let me provide the Premier and the Minister with another one. This is what the business community wrote to the Labour Minister today, and I quote, "Your lack of appreciation for the dire situation facing thousands of small businesses and workers calls into question the Premier's sincerity, and thousands of businesses now face what amounts to a regulated insolvency because of your inaction. End quote. So a very simple question. Will the Minister of Labour do his job and commit to extending the time limits today?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I don't know if the technology is not working across the province, but as I said to the member for Kamloops North Thompson, I'm happy to revisit this question and I will be speaking with many of the signatories of the letter on Thursday. And if that's not fast enough, we can set up an earlier call, but I think it's appropriate that we take the time. It's already scheduled. These are busy people working on a whole host of issues. But if it's a question, if the opposition has come to the point, Honourable Speaker, when they demand you make a call today instead of tomorrow, then so be it. Good question. Good question.
Member for Prince George Valemount on a supplemental.
Well, thank you very much. And we can save the Premier the time of making a phone call because, in fact, what he could do is commit today to extending the timelines. That's what business organizations are asking for. And this is what they said once again today. And perhaps the Premier may want to have a conversation with his Labour Minister. The business community repeatedly brought this looming issue to your government's attention beginning in early April. Regrettably, you have not reached out nor responded to our concerns until last Thursday, June 17th, leaving your ministerial duties to others, end quote. So to the Minister of Labour, apparently he hasn't had a conversation with the Premier. This has been a discussion item since early April, and the answer was no. So can the Minister of Labour explain why he would force the permanent layoff of workers, whether they or their employees like it or not?
Premier.
We have been discussing these and many other issues for over 100 days now. We've had a cross-government approach. The Minister and I reviewed this issue. We felt that Section 72, as I said, was appropriate. Clearly, these business organizations feel differently, and I am committing today to speak with them at a scheduled phone call on Thursday to address the question.
Member North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This seems to be an NDP pattern. Lots of discussions, lots of surveys, no action. Hard-hit small businesses are already struggling to survive, and the minister's inaction will now force them to pay significantly unnecessary costs, which will be the final straw for many businesses, sadly. For example, a restaurant with 30 staff would have to pay $100,000. So again, to the Minister of Labour, explain why he is forcing small businesses to permanently lay off workers and incur costs that they simply cannot afford.
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Unnecessary costs is how the leader or the opposition party refers to working people in British Columbia. Unnecessary costs. This is a severance question. The whole point why they're asking for relief is because they can't afford the severance. I thought that's what one of your questioners asked between reading paragraphs from a letter that I've acknowledged, I've received, and will respond to. But for a member of the opposition to say that it's unacceptable for business to be responsible for their employees, it's a bit rich. It's a bit rich.
Member North Vancouver Seymour on a supplemental.
What the NDP does not seem to understand that unnecessary costs to businesses cost people their jobs. Since early April, small businesses have repeatedly begged this government to act. What is being asked is just a simple fix to protect businesses from being permanently asked to fire their employees. It's this minister's inaction, not COVID-19, that will penalize small businesses and force them to shutter their operations for good. Will the Minister of Labour explain how businesses are supposed to do this?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, we've been working with businesses on a whole range of issues. One that the Attorney General just resolved not that long ago was wholesale pricing for the hospitality sector. That's going to save an enormous amount of money for small businesses. We put in place provisions to ensure that businesses wouldn't be evicted because there were property management companies that wouldn't apply for federal relief. We've been working hand in hand with our federal partners to find ways to fill gaps in the very generous programs they've brought forward. And it's been successful to this point in time. I assumed when we came back to the legislature, Honourable Speaker, when we could talk about these issues, we would bring up more than one piece of correspondence, albeit important, that I have acknowledged and said I will address before the week is out. Perhaps maybe you should get another refrain. You've had 100 days to figure out question period. I've acknowledged the issue. I've acknowledged the issue. We felt that the variance was appropriate. The opposition disagrees with us. They don't feel that we should protect the severance rights of individuals, but that's fine. We're going to work through this, and I'm sure that the opposition will take credit when the time comes. Oh, is that it?
The bill ends question period.